Hello, everyone. I want to welcome our special guest today, David Heinemeier Hansson, or DHH, as he's lovingly referred to in many different communities, the creator of Ruby on Rails, the founder and CTO at Basecamp, and the best-selling author of Rework, and of course, Remote Not Required. Please welcome DHH and talk about being such a Renaissance person. Not only do you do tech, you've been like a race car driver. This is nuts. So you have dabbled in both being a software engineer and a CEO. You get to do both of these. How do you keep that up?
Yeah, I think it's just if you go long enough, eventually there'll be time enough. I mean, this wasn't something I arrived at in like 18 months of doing these things. I've been doing web programming for the past 20 years. I've been building Basecamp alongside Jason Fried, my business partner, for the past 17 years. And
Wow.
I've been driving race cars for the past, 12 years now. So it doesn't all happen at once. I think it's just taking the time to do it and then making sure there is that time, right? Like a big thing for us at Basecamp is this idea that 40 hours is enough. I don't need to dedicate more than 40 hours a week to work. And then if you don't do that, oh, lo and behold, there's time for other things outside of computers. And that means for me, for a long time, it meant on the weekends, I would go to the racetrack or I would do studying other things in the evening or any of these other things that we can do when we don't dedicate our lives solely just to one pursuit. So I think that's really the secret, which is not at all a secret, right? Like it just seems so because, especially in technology, and especially in entrepreneurial startup circles, it's such a trite cliche that people have to be 150% dedicated to just this one thing, and all their working hours and all their attention has to be focused on making that a success, right?
It's the hustle, right? It's the hustle. You gotta hustle.
Yes,
right.
Exactly. And I think that's perhaps the main secret is we don't hustle. There's no hustle at Basecamp. There's just good work for about 40 hours a week. And you know what? You do that long enough on an idea that has resonance and it'll be fine. And it was fine, right? Because from the start, we were never trying to become like billionaires, right? We're not trying to build a unicorn. We were trying to build a nice, wonderful business that would take great care of us, our 50-ish employees, and our customers. And that didn't require us dominating the industry. It didn't require us crushing the competition. It just required us building a nice product that people wanted to buy. And that was it. Then there was room for a life outside of just the pursuit of a startup success.
Oh, I totally agree. As somebody who's been quite involved with music and horses at the same time, I definitely had to somehow balance it and make it work and still show dedication. So I found, at least in my case, and I'm sure for yours as well, that the quality of the focus time you give your work matters. So if you're just doing an assembly line of the same thing every day and you're not really engaged, you're not going to give the best parts of your work during that 40 hours.
100%. And not only that, but also just like how are those 40 hours spent? A lot of people spend 40 hours in a tiny chunks. They have an hour and a half here and they have 2 hours there and then they have meeting, or they have other interruptions. I think a key success to my own accomplishments in technology has been like, oh, here's 4 hours, here's 5 hours where I do nothing or mostly nothing, than the thing I'm set down to do. This is why for us at Basecamp, remote work has been such a huge thing. I learned early on in my career that I just worked poorly in an office. I couldn't reliably get into the zone. I couldn't just dedicate myself to the deep work. And then I kept finding that if I worked at home, or if I worked before people arrived, or if I worked after people arrived, boom, all this creativity, all this magic would come out, and I'd be like, why isn't that the normal mode? Why isn't that what's happening during work, right? So the way we've tried to structure Basecamp is such that can happen during work, at least for the majority of the time. So I think just the focus on, like, it's not about just getting more and more hours. Oh, can you get 60 hours, can you get 80 hours, can you get 100 hours? It's the motivation you take with you into those hours, as you say, like doing work you actually care about, you're actually interested in, and then spinning that around long stretches of uninterrupted time.
Oh, absolutely. So I know that you did a YouTube series called Writing Software Well. Is there any chance for you to start that up again?
Oh, 100%. I want to get back to that. I left it sort of, it was funny. I think in like the second episode, I went like, oh, there's this thing I really want to talk about. And then I kept dropping hints to it. And then I never got back to it. We started working on a new product at Basecamp called Hey. It's a new email service, hey.com.
Yes.
And we've been working on that for the past 18 months or so. I've been working on that for the last 18 months or so. And that's one of those things, as we talked about, like, how do you make time for it all? There isn't time for it all. It has to be a little bit in phases. So when I'm full in on a new product, it was the same thing with any of the other products we've made. I tend to just dedicate myself to that mostly. And then everything else gets put on the back burner. And then we're just about to release Hey, hopefully not too long now. It kind of, we were meant to put it out in April. Pandemic hits, we go like, you know what? That's not good for our employees. It's not good for anyone else to have like the stress of a major launch right now. We're going to punt it a bit, but we're close, right? Like we were supposed to launch in April. We've been using this software for a while now. We have a tiny group of beta testers on there. Then after that's out, I can get back to the teaching. So that's the other kind of approach that we've taken at Basecamp, is that our marketing approach for the past 20 years has been to out-teach, not outspend. First, it was sort of a necessity, right? Like there just wasn't any money to outspend anyone. We didn't raise any money. We had to build the business off the revenues we brought in selling our products. So there just wasn't the money. The alternative was there was time, there was energy, there was enthusiasm for new technology. We were one of the early companies that picked up Ruby. In 2003, I went to the first, it was called the International Ruby Conference. It was the third International Ruby Conference in the US, and I think we were 40 people. And when someone in the audience asked, how many are getting paid to work with Ruby? 2 hands went up, right? Like, so this was 2003. Not a lot of people kind of doing Ruby. I found Ruby through Martin Fowler and Dave Thomas's writings. I thought, this is a wonderful programming. Why aren't more people using it? Clearly, it must be in part because they just don't know. They don't know that there's this wonderful programming language. They don't know what you can use it for. Hey, I found it. This is really making me happy. I can take the things that I'm building, which turned to be Ruby on Rails, extracted from the first version of Basecamp. I can share those things and I can start talking about it. So we've done that with a bunch of different things: technology, with programming, with how we design things, with how we do project management, with how we run a company, with how we do remote work. Basically anything where we feel like, hey, we've taken the time to get good at this, or at least we've discovered something that doesn't seem widespread. Let's share that. Let's share the lessons that we have and put them out broadly. And there's going to be a tiny minority of people who see something that, like, hey, I go in the stream or I talk about Ruby on Rails, we do any of these things and go like, oh, I'm curious, where does that come from? Then they go to the company. Like, it's a nice side effect that if you have a passion for sharing and teaching, that some of those people you end up sharing with or teaching will be interested in the things that you also make, and maybe that will turn into something good as well. So that's kind of been the approach, and that's what we're taking here now too. We're finishing up hey.com. I have such a backlog of technology that comes out of that. Like, we build a bunch of new things, we build a bunch of new frameworks, a whole new approach on the front end, and I just dying to share. So
we're dying to see
get it out there.
Absolutely. So on that note, I'm assuming that this is open source. Yes, no, or is it like secret?
Yes. Well,
it is open source.
The service itself, as just like Basecamp, is not open source. Well, actually, that's not true. It is open source in the sense that, like, I, as a general sort of approach to building software, I take everything that's a generic tool that I'm building and I make that open source. This is why when you look at when Basecamp first launched, I'd be like, oh, Basecamp is only so and so many lines of code. Yeah, of course it's only so many lines of code, because I kicked out everything that was even vaguely generic into open source, and that's what we're building on top of, which is the same thing with hey.com. We've already open sourced a bunch of libraries that we ended up using. Rails now ships with something called Action Mailbox, which is a framework for processing inbound mail, which is exactly what we needed in Hey to do inbound mail processing, right? So we take all this technology that we end up building for our products, and then anything that's generic, we kick that out. But at the same time, I also, I don't have like Stallman free software or death
Sure.
approach to everything, which means that like I believe in having viable businesses that charge money for software, and that's how they get to do these things, right? The fact that we've been able to charge money for Basecamp for 20 years is how I got to spend a lot of my time building Ruby on Rails and doing all these other things and giving
Exactly.
those things back. If that wasn't there, it wouldn't have been the same thing. I mean, we all got to eat, and I think that there's nothing wrong with that. Like taking a product. In fact, I think, and maybe this is just self-serving here, but I think you write better open source software like that, right? Like when you write it specifically for a purpose that you have, that you really need to, you're building a product, it drives the vision for it, and that's what we've been doing, and been driving a bunch of these things with Hey.com that we're spinning out, and it's also how you just get new ideas. Like I find if I just sit down and I think like, oh, let me write open source software. No, that's not how I approach things. I sit down and like, I want to solve this specific problem. I'm going to solve it with these ways. Oh, I'm missing this thing. Let me just build it. And then I'll build this thing and I'll go like, oh, I have a new thing. Let me just put that out in the world. And when we all do that together, all at the same time, we get communities like Ruby on Rails, where you have thousands of people all going like, oh, I needed this thing. I need this thing. And then we all come together. We all exchange and we share and we go like, hey, I built this thing. I can use your thing and you can use my thing. And before we know it, we have this huge community of people who are just helping each other, making it ever easier for newcomers to start something up today. I think of like what I had to start with when I got into Ruby in 2003 and what we have today in 2020 with Ruby on Rails. It's just such a boost. You get so many things for free. It takes so little effort to do a bunch of the things that used to be really hard. So.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that. It's amazing just in the time that I've been involved in tech and I'm a career changer, just how much I've seen things change, like enormously just in my own platform. So you, I know in the past have said that you wanted to raise your son to be a rebel, you know, to develop into somebody that doesn't follow the status quo, right? So in the spirit of that, if one of your employees comes to you and says they want to create a whole new development platform for the web because the way it's being done today is stupid, do you let them do it? Or is there still value in that known status quo from a business standpoint?
Oh, this is how we've incubated almost everything. That like individual employees at Basecamp had looked at how things were or how we were doing it or things we built in the past and said, maybe they didn't say it was stupid, but they said like, I have a better idea. And in almost all cases, we've pursued those. A bunch of the frameworks we've ended up splitting out, especially on the front end, have come from the research and fidelity team, for example, that we have at Basecamp, which is Sam Stevenson and Javon McMalley, who tricks our text editor. It came out of us using a bunch of open source text editors in Basecamp 2, kept getting error and bug reports that like using these WYSIWYG things that were built on content editable. You didn't have a lot of control. There's just not a lot we could do. When we got bug reports like, hey, when I bold this and I paste this in, it looks like shit, we could just go like, nothing we can do about it. So we went like, do you know what? Actually, there is something we can do about it. Sam and Javon went off. They built Tricks, an entire text editing platform from scratch because they thought they had a better idea. Yes, that was a long, arduous process. It would have been cheaper just to go with like something off the shelf, but it
faster or whatever.
Move things forward, right? Like we wouldn't have moved anything forward, and we have this over and over again in the business. I mean, most of the time we end up sort of not rethinking everything from scratch, right? Like we're constantly building on top of the lessons that we have, and sometimes that building on top means you yank something out from early in the change because you just have better ideas. But a lot of times it just means like, oh, now we have this solid base of, let's say, Ruby on Rails. It does all of these basic things we need to do. Oh, actually, now I have an insight that we can put two of the things together and we can build a third thing on top. That's how things like active storage, for example, came about, where we just have a fully baked in native setup to do cloud file uploads, right? But it's building on top of the fact that we have an object relational mapping system called Active Record, and it can assume that that's there, right? So we keep building on top. We keep making sort of the progress in ways, because you do one layer and you see that that layer is good, and then instantly you get motivation and ambition for more, right? So that's the path. We keep pulling on that. I don't think we've ever had like an idea for something like this where we went like, oh no, we're not going to do it. Like that's too difficult, too expensive, too whatever. we're always, I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm still interested in doing this work, right? Like we're always chasing sort of that new insight, that new simplification, that new conceptual compression, where we can take something that used to be hard or difficult or require a lot of configuration, and we can go like, oh, put these 4 things together. We push it down, boom. The text editor tricks is a great example. We put that out, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. Then the latest version of Ruby on Rails ships with essentially a plugin adaptation of that called action text, where you can do the full pipeline processing of HTML, and you can pull out attachments. You can do inline attachments with previews, because that builds on top of active storage. And yeah, that's sort of the excitement for that next step that keeps me going in tech.
Absolutely. Same. I think the moment that I see an improvement, it's like I got a little bit of a snowball effect that happened to me. Sometimes it's hard, though, to get into that mindset, because if you get too overwhelmed with splitting your time between your job coding and then you're doing maybe open source coding on the side or stuff for yourself on top of that, how do you manage to do so much with Basecamp and Hey.com without burning out? And if you've already been burnt out, how did you come back from it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One realization is at Basecamp, open source is work. So when we do tricks or we do any of these other things, we do it during business hours. Like this is not something that employees have to donate their time to do. Some employees do some of the time because this also happens to be a hobby for several of us, right? Like for me, for example, Ruby on Rails is both a tool I use for work to do good things for the company, and it's also a community that I really enjoy, a hobby, writing better code, collaborating with others in the industry. So there's somewhat of a fluidness between those two things, but I've from the get-go had, as we talked about earlier, that intention that, do you know what, it can't be all of it. Like I'm going to be a worse CTO, I'm going to be actually a worse programmer, I'm going to be a lot of things if I have such a tunnel vision that the only thing I think about 24/7 is code, whether it's for work or it's for open source. So I've taken it as my own sort of approach that, like, do you know what, I love doing this. And sometimes, like just this Sunday, we just kicked off a new initiative in Rails called the May of What the Fucks. So it's a forum basically where we were going to spend a month sharing our WTFs about the experience of using Ruby on Rails, particularly for newcomers, right? Like, or even people who've used it for a long time who are stumped by things, how they work in Rails, why did they work like that? And I just like, do you know what? That's fun. Like it's fun for me. Like I get to learn some of this stuff. I go like, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing or that was a problem. Someone will raise an issue and I'll go like, oh yeah, it's totally right. Let me just try to do it, right? So that was on a Sunday. I took like an hour and a half or something to sit down, read through the blog post or the forum post, and worked with someone on a tiny little pull request for Rails. You know what? And then I went back to swimming in the pool with my kids, and then we played Legos, and then we played Minecraft, and then we watched the movie, and then we did 1,000 other things that you should do to leave sort of a wholesome life that is not just focused on a single activity.
Absolutely, because our value isn't in pushing a button or pushing a cart. This is our value. Our value is our minds and how we apply it. So if you don't take care of that with some breaks and balance, how in the world are you supposed to be like ultimately valuable in that way? I agree.
And you are going to burn out. You're going to burn out, as you say. I mean, this industry is full of people who burned out because they poured in the 80 hours or the 100 hours or whatever into just the one thing for too long. And then all of a sudden they looked up and like couldn't recognize who they were or hadn't seen their friends or hadn't done anything else. And then the problem is you put all your eggs in one basket. And you know what? Most things fail, right? So you put all your eggs in that one basket and then that one basket blows up. Like, where the fuck are all your eggs? They're splattered all over the place and there's nothing left for you to hold on to. Take some of the eggs, put them in some of the other baskets, right? Like diversify your ego just a little bit so that you have other interests, other things that you do, so that if things get hard at work or work entirely blows up, it's not like the sum total of who you are.
Absolutely. So when it comes to trying to organize your thoughts, because obviously we are thread switching, right, between like the rest of our life, maybe a hobby, doing whatever we want to do in tech. How do you consume like books, for example, effectively and retain the learning? Like, do you focus on audiobooks at increased speed levels, or do you still use a regular book? And then after that, do you end up journaling by hand or maybe digitally?
That's a good question. So for a long time, I did all my reading on the Kindle. When the Kindle came out, I thought like, oh, this is the greatest invention ever. I have access to all the books that's ever been made, and so this digital advice. And you know what? There's still something to that, but these days I don't use the Kindle anymore. I've gone back to paper books. In terms of the experience of reading a book, I thought like, you know what? The hardware is actually better. The paper hardware is better for the majority of use cases I have, which are reading around the house, right? You can see exactly where you are. It's easier to flip back and forth. Like the technology of the book is actually really good. Like, wow, big revelation here. People have known this for hundreds of years, but like the idea of the book is pretty good. And then on the other hand, what I also do is I also use audiobooks. And I particularly use audiobooks when I'm traveling.
Yes, same.
Particularly when I'm driving. Like for me, it's funny. I can't listen actually to audiobooks if I don't have another activity. Whatever, my mind is not well suited for that, just sitting down and listening. But if I'm doing something else like driving a car, I love listening to audiobooks. I've probably like a third of the reading I do, I've done through audiobooks in the last few years, and it's all driving. I get 30 minutes here. Sometimes I have to drive like 3 hours. Boom, audiobooks. Otherwise, it's books themselves. I don't take a lot of notes. I never have. As a student, I never took notes either. I was always like, you know what? The challenge for me is, can I read something and can I retain the core conclusions?
Ooh, that's a lot.
It's not necessarily. It is, but and it didn't always work either, right? Like you try to read a biology book and you perhaps don't care that much about biology. You know what? You're probably going to fail the test, and I failed plenty of tests on that account. But then on the other hand, I still recall and retain lots of learnings I had in high school from history classes or from literature classes, because I actually internalized sort of the conclusions. I didn't get all of it. I didn't write it all down, but the things that were there, I could carry them with me for 30 years versus I've talked to my wife about this a lot. She was an A+ student the whole way through, valedictorian, all the full, take all the notes, do all the stuff, right? And then we talk about like, okay, so let's talk about some of the things you actually retained from some of these classes you got an A+ in. And she's like, I mean, the majority of it, I didn't. Not that she didn't retain anything in any cases, but just that, hey, you can get an A+ very well because you're very studious and you take good notes and do all these things. And then it's just flushed as soon as that semester's over, right? And I was like, do you know what? That just wasn't the path I took or could take or whatever, which I ended up flunking a bunch of classes. I did well in some other classes, and then hopefully I retained some of it long term. So I've retained that. Maybe this is just all an elaborate excuse for being lazy and not wanting to take notes or whatever, but that's the approach I've taken.
I was not a good note taker, but I have a very small cache and it gets constantly flushed. So I have to now, in order for me to toggle between the tasks that I have, I was really just put my foot down about it. I think that there is value though in not relying solely on it. Absolutely. I think you're correct. I just have one more question for you, and it's a big one. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. So I know that lots of developers are a little overwhelmed with whether they are working now or not, with where to focus, because we talk about if you don't like the state of things, then go find another way to build it. But right now, when everybody's so concerned about being valuable to a company somewhere, if they don't have the resources themselves to just go out on their own, that can be a struggle, right? So if you were to say, this is what will make a senior developer going forward, what would you tell the majority of developers to focus on for the next few years?
That's a good, hard, deep question. It's something we've tried to tackle over the past 5+ issues at Basecamp, trying to get career paths. What does it actually look like? What is the difference between a senior developer and a junior developer or lead developer and principal developer? And it's not easy. I'd say, though, that some of the characteristics that I found is writing is something that never goes out of style. Becoming a better writer, both in prose, but it's my belief that for at least the high-level kind of code that we do for web application development, it translates directly. You become a better writer of prose, you become a better programmer. I had a whole, I think it was 2014, maybe the keynote at RailsConf about how programming is like writing. So I'd say focusing on improving your writing skills. Some of that comes, as we just talked about, from just reading. I've become a far better writer. The more I read, the better I write. So reading more, and I'm not talking about like technical books. Those are fine too, but they're not usually sort of hallmarks of great writing. A few of them are, majority are not. They're about teaching you some specific technical skills. Become a better writer by reading a broader variety of things, learning how people structure complete arguments. And I mean, when I say to reading, I read a little bit of nonfiction, but I read a little bit of fiction, but I mostly read nonfiction. And I just picked up so much about how to structure a good argument. And to me, structuring a good program is very much like structuring a good argument. Like, where do you put the emphasis? What's out front? How are sort of the paragraphs arranged? What are the headings? Like all this naming activity, we say there's two hard things left in computer science, right? Like it's cache expiration and naming things.
Naming things always.
Naming things, right? Like becoming a better writer is how you become better at naming things. Finding just the right metaphor can really unlock a technical problem where you think like, oh, I can't see how the objects or the pieces fit together. Do you know what? Sometimes it's just one word. So one of my favorite programming tools is the dictionary. I use the dictionary 5 times a day. I'm trying to find just the right words. I use the thesaurus. I look up these alternative words that I can use. So becoming a better programmer, I think the surest path, the thing that's going to pay off 50 years from now, if we're still working with computers ourselves and AI hasn't taken over everything, it's become a better writer.
Absolutely. David, it has been such a pleasure talking to you about what we can look forward to next and how we can improve ourselves. So I know we're all struggling right now, but thank you for being the voice of the future for a lot of us, and keep at it.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and take care.